we will proceed to today's discussion. So let me just highlight some of the
Our instructor sound is not audible for me. What about for you?
He is disconnected, Sami.
Okay. Ase, ደህና ናችሁ?
How are you, Sami? ሰላም ነው?
እግዚአብሔር ይመስገን። እንዴት ናችሁ?
ሰላም ነው። እንዴት ነው? ጃጁራ ሰላም ነው?
ጃጁራ ሰላም ነው። ታውቃታለህ እንደ
አይወራት ግንብቹ ፎር ሎንግ
በቃ ግንብቹ ከሆንክ በቃ ጎረቤት ሆነናላ።
No, I was a teacher there for before 20 or something back years.
Okay, in Gimbichu.
Yeah, Gimbichu High School. I was a teacher. From 1985 to 1989, according to Avukara, which is too long anyway.
At that time, I haven't started my education.
You might not have been even born.
Yeah. It is good.
I have rich experience in teaching. I have been for 36 years. I am a teacher for 36 years.
Okay. I'm very heavy. I'm for 5 years or 4 years teacher.
You are too young anyway, as compared to me. You are too young.
Yeah. Now you are where?
I'm at Hawassa now.
At Hawassa. I was study MA class in Hawassa University since 2050 up to 2016.
Okay. You are too young.
Yeah.
ምን ጀመራችሁ ነው የለም ብላችሁ አሰፋ?
ሳሚ ጋር ነው እያወራን ያለ ነው።
Sorry, I think my network is acting up, so I hope it will resolve itself. But let's continue. So I was just talking about the course syllabus, I believe. I want to start by reminding you some of the requirements, just to encourage you to start working on them and to clarify some elements. So let me share the screen, and then we will talk about the course. Okay. Is my screen visible?
Not yet.
Okay. So, as I've said, this course is going to be a course on the Second Temple period. Second Temple period is a very important period to understand the New Testament, as it is the immediate context of the New Testament. In fact, it can be argued that the New Testament itself is part of that period. It's a reflection of that period in many important ways. So it really is imperative to understand Second Temple period and the literatures that were produced during that time in order to understand the New Testament better. It's like saying you need to understand the last 30 and 40 years in Ethiopian history and the kind of literature that were produced during that time in order to understand the current political climate or something to that effect. So it really is imperative. It's not a luxury. Understanding the New Testament period. The New Testament requires that we understand that period. So we've seen some introductions. We've tried to define that period. We said, roughly speaking, we can define that period as ranging from the 6th century before Christ, that is, starting from the time the first temple was destroyed, or that is the exile, and up to AD 70, when Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans. So it really is a period between two temples, right? It starts right after the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and for all intents and purposes, we can consider that it has ended when Second Temple was destroyed. So, of course, there are some variations, as I'm sure you will find them when you read. Some would prefer to, for example, put the end dates up to AD 140 something or 130 something. They want to include what we call the Bar Kokhba revolt, or the final Jewish revolt that finally led the Romans to prohibit them from entering into Jerusalem as a whole. Some prefer to include that period as Second Temple period as well, but that's just too nuanced of a discussion to get into it for now. Okay, so some of the course requirements for this are okay. Let me open my PDF again. Okay, I believe you can see it now. Okay, thank you, Asafa. So the first assignment is going to be a written assignment on the Book of Tobit. Sorry, my computer is acting up. I don't know what's wrong. It was open for a long time, so I think that's why. So just give me 1 minute. Let me refresh some things. Okay, let's close this. Now let's open this. I can also close this one. And I can also close logos. Okay. Okay. Let's give it a shot now. Yes. Okay. Okay, good. I apologize for the inconvenience. So the first assignment is going to be a written assignment, an essay on the Book of Tobit. The Book of Tobit is going to be one of the books that we will study as part of this course. It's a tale, it's a narrative that we call it Tobit in Amharic. So most of you, not most of you, but those of you who have an Orthodox background are already familiar with the story. So it's a very interesting story. It's easy to read. It's also very brief. It will not be too cumbersome for you. But we will study that text and we will see. And the assignment is for you to write a theological paper on it. So I expect you to trace some of the theological themes it picks up, and you can, for example, compare it with the New Testament. For example, it talks about righteousness, it talks about providence. Angels play a major role in that story. So what I want you to do is you can find this in the course syllabus description, but you can, for example, compare what the Book of Tobit teaches regarding righteousness and what, for example, the New Testament or Paul teaches about righteousness, and then you can compare them, for example, or you can, for example, try to see if there is a continuity between them, things like that. So so this really is your written assignment. It's going to be over 30 points. So there are very various kind of scholar resources that talk about the Book of Tobit. So you can, I expect you to engage with that kind of material as well. So study it, try to see if there is some kind of continuity between what the Book of Tobit teaches, what the Book of Tobit assumes about God, and, for example, you can compare it with the New Testament, or you can even compare it with the Old Testament as well. But a deep dive on the Book of Tobit is going to be your written assignment. As I've said last time, I have chosen to make this course a very exam incentive kind of course. So your major assessment is going to be exam. So it's essential that you read the assigned readings. I've provided the resources in the Telegram group, or you can also find them in the shared drive. So the reading log is also present in the shared drive. So start reading, for example, De Silva or Van der Kam, the books that I've assigned, and the exam is going to be based on those readings and our class discussions. So the main assessment is going to be the exam. So I encourage you to focus on that, to start reading as soon as possible, to engage with the material, and you can, as always, feel free to ask me any questions if there are any questions. Other than that, your other task is going to be to write that paper on the Book of Tobit. The reading log is supposed to help you read. It serves as an incentive to read. So when you are trying to prepare for the exam in a direct way, you are also fulfilling the reading log. So the two feed on each other. So that shouldn't be a burden to you. So my advice for this course is going to be read as much as possible. And whenever you find any difficulty, if some concepts are too much, you can of course explore them. You can browse the internet to find additional things, but if those are not enough, feel free to shoot me an email. Feel free to ask any questions, and we will deal with those kind of questions more later. Other than that, it's going to be a very straightforward course. So I've learned that we won't have a class starting from week 4, I believe. So next week we will talk about general overview of Second Temple Jewish writings, and after you're done with the 2 courses that you're supposed to take, we will continue from narrative works, which in fact is a better it's a better schedule. It works for us because today's discussion and the next discussion is going pretty much to be an overview, a generic kind of approach. So after we come back from your 2 courses, we will start getting into the depths. We will specifically talk about each individual works and things like that. So in a way, the interruption works for us. It won't be too disruptive, but still it's going to be difficult for you to continue continue and pick up where we left off. So I encourage you to find a way of engaging with the material as you're also studying the two courses. I understand that time would be an issue, but I encourage you to find some kind of ways. For example, the best way would be, for example, it would be for you to start working on the assignments. That way you can keep connected. You can remain connected with the course. So I encourage you to do that. But of course, we will try and revise the major points when you come back from your journey, so to say. So let's do that. I think it's clear, right? Let's revise what we discussed last week, and we will proceed to discussion. If you have any questions regarding this, if there is something unclear, feel free to ask. Okay. In that case, let's talk about the historical events of the Second Temple period. Before that, just to remind you what we discussed last week, we pretty much said, I tried to make the case that understanding the Second Temple period is essential to understand the New Testament, right? So the first thing we did was I tried to highlight some allusions and some quotations we find in the New Testament that directly go back to these writings. So, for example, we saw how Jude relies on First Enoch. We also saw how the Synoptic Gospels rely on the Book of Sirach. So there really is intertextuality between the New Testament and these writings. So even though we don't consider them canonical, and even though the New Testament writers probably don't consider them as canonical too, it doesn't mean they didn't know them. As I tried to provide you an analogy, they were really very popular during that time. So even though the New Testament writers didn't consider them as authoritative, there is a very high probability, and in fact there are evidences in the New Testament that they actually engaged and read these books. So these books, in a way, are the books that the New Testament writers read. These books, in a way, have influenced them. The presentation slide is not moving, but listening only. Okay, Lucas. So this is. I think this is not the slide. This is the course syllabus. So I'm just trying to revise what we talked about last week. So I'm not using the PowerPoint for now. So there is that kind of connection between the New Testament. In addition, you should also remember that there is a theological development that can only make sense of if you understand these writings. For example, we took the case of the theology of Satan we find in the New Testament, right? If you read the Old Testament and then compare it with the New Testament, you would see a very sharp distinction between the theology of Satan, the devil that we find in the Old Testament, and the theology of the devil we find in the New Testament. The Old Testament seems to propose a very one-sided understanding of Satan, in which Satan is constantly presented to us as the accuser, and the name he almost always is assigned to him is what we call Satan's accuser. And the role he plays is always accusing. Of course, there are some exceptions, but the New Testament, in a way, present to us a very sophisticated understanding of Satan, in which Satan is treated as a very powerful power that tries to oppose God. And we also find names like Belial, in which names that are completely absent from the Old Testament. So if we don't take into account these writings that were written between the Old and the New Testament, it would be a bit difficult to understand where these terms developed and how we should define them. But these writings, for example, writings like First Enoch, provide us an understanding in which we see how the New Testament writers picked up these ideas from those writings. So there is also theological development. So understanding the Second Temple period and the literatures that were produced during that time will also help us understand some of the theological development we find in the New Testament. So in a way, they can feel that gap, the gap between First Temple Judaism, or between the Old Testament, some of the Old Testament, and the New Testament. So understanding these books is essential. We also saw that they are important because they can provide us with historical context, right? They will at least tell us the history of that period. So, for example, we will talk about this today, of course, but figures like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, we don't really know how they developed or where they come from, right? The Old Testament is absent about these groups in Judaism, but they are everywhere in the New Testament. So these writings can shed light on questions like, where did the Pharisees come from? When did they form? What kind of role did they play? And things like that. These writings can give us historical account as well. They can be used as historical evidence as well. So they are very important, and the reason we study them is because we understand that they are useful to understand the New Testament. So even though we don't, so just because we study them or just because we read them, it doesn't mean we treat them as authoritative or as inspired by God, but they are useful. Just like we read other books today, some written by Christians. We even read some non-Christian works, right? And we don't treat them as authoritative or as inspired by God, but we still manage to get something good out of them. We can approach these books with this attitude as well. And they are not dangerous, and it's not oftentimes the case that they present some heretical or dangerous theological idea. That's not the case oftentimes. These writings propose a very orthodox understanding of God, a very orthodox in a sense, a very direct understanding, a very correct understanding. I'm not talking about the church. A very proper kind of understanding about God, because as we will see in detail later on, later in the course, these writings were written by Jews, by monotheistic and Orthodox Jews. They were not written by some heretic groups or things like that. So they are not something to be feared of. They are not something to be avoided, and they can help us understand the New Testament better, because, as you know, the New Testament has a very Jewish background, and understanding that background will shed light on very important elements. So that's the reason we study these works. So that was what we tried to do last week. I tried to make the case that this course is worth your time. These writings are worth your time. So that was our discussion last week. So today I want to talk about history of the Second Temple period. So the rest of the course will focus on the writings, on the actual literatures themselves. But in order to understand these literatures, in order to understand these writings, it's important to understand the historical context that gave birth to these writings as well. The period that they were written in is very important to understand the writings. Just like the period the New Testament was written in is essential to understand the New Testament. The same can be said for these writings as well, or any other writing. In fact, in order to understand books or works that are being written today, it's also important to understand the context that they are operating in, right? So the historical context is important. So the Second Temple period, as we've said, is almost 600 years long. So it's important to understand what kind of major historical movements were happening during that time. So we can't possibly cover everything, since 600 years is vast, right? But we can try and have a contour of things. We can try to draw very broad strokes, and we can identify major movements and see how they are relevant to understand these writings. So that's what we will try to do for today. We will try and understand the history. What kind of things were happening when these writings were being written. Okay. We're clear so far, right? Feel free to ask anytime. Okay, so let's see some of the historical events of Second Temple period. Okay, let's start first by talking about the sources. So as I've already said, most of the sources for this period are the kind of documents that we will study later on. So, for example, when we say during this period, the Greeks were ruling or the Persians were ruling or things like that, we need to have actual primary source, right, in order to reconstruct that history. So we will try to identify those sources. The first one is we have archaeological evidences that can help us understand this period better. So archaeological evidence are material evidence, as you know. We have, for example, inscriptions. We also have some dug up buildings that give us hints about the kind of things that were happening during that time. So the first is we have archaeological evidence in order to talk about this period. The first one is a portion of the Old Testament, or this portion of Old Testament that talks about post-exilic events is also important historically in order to talk about this period. So, for example, books like Ezra and books like Nehemiah, books like Haggai, Zechariah, these are post-exilic. So they also give us information about what was happening, especially during the Persian period, that is, after the Israelites returned from exile. We also have a source by the name of Josephus. Josephus, the historian, he's also a very important source, especially because he's a Jew himself. So he gives us the history of Israel up to AD 70 from a very Jewish perspective. So there are, for example, other sources, but some of those sources are Greek or Roman, and they have their own biases. Of course, Josephus has his own bias as well, but at least his bias is Jewish, and he can tell us how the Jews themselves saw what was happening during that time from their own perspective. So in addition to that, the Apocrypha themselves, we will talk about these books in detail in the coming few weeks, but the Apocrypha itself, the Pseudepigrapha, the Dead Sea Scrolls, all these Jewish writings that were written during that time tell us what was happening, and these sources can be used historically as well. They are not only theological, they can be used to reconstruct the history of that period. So when I say, for example, this happened during this period or this happened during that period, we are talking about a history that was reconstructed from these sources. Okay, so the story of Second Temple period starts from the exile, specifically the Babylonian exile. As you know, Israel had two exiles, right? The first exile, it happened in the 8th century before Christ. That is the northern kingdom. It was taken exile at the hand of the Assyrians. So, for example, we can see this story being reported to us in 2 Kings 15 through 17. So the first exile happened during the 8th century, and it happened to the northern part of Israel. So it's the part that we now call Galilee and or the Testament in addition to Galilee, Tyre, Sidona, ጢሮስና ሲዶና እነዚህ ፓርቶች ማለት ነው። So this we can talk about this exile as well, but this was not as important as the second exile that happened during the 6th century before Christ. This is only because during Second Temple, during this exile, second exile, the temple was also destroyed. As you know, the southern part is important because that's where the temple is located. That's where Jerusalem is located. So that is when we say exile, we are primarily talking about the Babylonian exile, in which the southern or Judah, Samaria and Judah was taken captive by the Babylonians, and more importantly, the exile, the temple was destroyed. This really is important in order to understand Second Temple period. Not only the Second Temple period, but it's also important to understand why it's necessary to divide Israel's history as the First Temple period and the Second Temple period. Because the temple was destroyed, a very consequential theological and political shift had occurred in Israel. that makes it necessary for us to see these periods differently, because the destruction of the temple and the exile as a whole and the destruction of the kingdom, it was a very essential and it was very consequential. So since it was a very dramatic event, and since it was a very consequential event, it really is important to see the period before that and the period after that separately. So the reason the reason we talk about Second Temple period rather than talking about the ancient history of Israel as a whole, it really has to do with the exile. The exile, it had a very serious consequences, not only politically, but theologically as well. Politically speaking, as you know, after the exile, after the destruction of the temple, and after the destruction of Jerusalem, as you know, the Davidic line was cut, right? The Davidic line was cut really. Aside from a very brief, not brief actually, almost 100 years, but aside from a very marginal event that happened during the Hasmonean period, Israel had remained governmentless. It had remained kingdomless up until 1948, as you know. So it was very consequential politically, the exile. In addition to that, it was also very consequential theologically. As you know, the temple is the physical manifestation of God's presence for the Israelites. In their understanding, in their cosmology, it's as if heaven and earth actually meet in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. So the temple really is a physical manifestation that God actually dwells among them. It really is where where the center of their theology relied. So the destruction of that means it simply is theologically too consequential. Because of the exile, they had to modify their theology. They had to reevaluate some of their theological beliefs. They had to reevaluate their identity. They also had to reevaluate what kind of existence they need to exist after the destruction of the temple. And it simply was consequential. It was a very physical manifestation of the fact that God has abandoned them because of their sin. The destruction of the temple was a physical manifestation that God indeed has abandoned them and that their sin has proved to be too much. So the exile was a very serious event. Okay, we can't overstate the importance of the exile in order to understand the theology of the Second Temple period. Not only that, this can be said for the theology of the New Testament as well. The theology of the New Testament, in a way, is a solution to the problem of the exile, right? It's an answer to the problem of the exile. Hence, the reason we divide this period because saying the first temple period and second temple period is because the exile was a very, very, very serious event. Hence, it's the immediate background for understanding the New Testament way more than the first temple period is important to understand the New Testament. So the period of the first temple came to an end in 587 or 586 when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple. So during this period, Judah, that is the southern part of Israel, was being ruled by the Neo-Babylonian kings, by kings like Nebuchadnezzar. So as I've said, this was a very dark time for the Jews. And the theological rationale the prophets provided was that this was happening because of their sin, right? This is the result of their sin. So they had to repent if they want to come back to the land. As you know, the land is extremely important for the Jews. This actually goes back to Genesis as well. Sin and exile are interrelated, right? Think of Adam, for example. When Adam sins, God, in a way, sends him to exile, right? He was guided out of Eden, and he was in a way under exile. This happens in Egypt as well. Because of their sins, the Israelites are sent to Egypt. And this happens during the Assyrian exile as well. That's how the Old Testament explains it. Israel, the northern part of Israel, was given to exile because of their idolatry, because they worshipped other gods, because of their sin. And the same is, we find the same thing in the Babylonian exile as well. They are sent to exile because they sinned. So this is a very deep theological motive, and the way the prophets cope up with this phenomenon was to explain it as being the manifestation or as the appropriate result of the sin of Israel. So the exile is very important, and it was a time of serious crisis. This crisis was not necessarily political as well, but theological as well. It was very, very theologically consequential. It's so a good example would be, for example, think of, for example, what you consider very sacred, ultimate sacred, and that sacred being, that sacred thing, that sacred material being destroyed, being mocked by Gentiles, by those you consider to be beneath you. So that's pretty much what happened to the Israelites. They used to think, or they thought, that they are better than the Gentiles because they have the Torah, because they have the temple, and all that. But the Gentiles that they despise, the Gentiles that they think are inferior to them, they somehow managed to destroy what they ultimately consider to be sacred. So that was the ultimate manifestation that God has indeed abandoned them, hence the theological crisis that we are talking about. So as I've already said, the exile is not only necessary to understand what happened during this period, but it's also essential to understand the New Testament as well. For example, think of the proclamation that we find in the Synoptic Gospels, in which Jesus talks about the kingdom of God being at hand, the kingdom of God returning. He is talking about the exile in a way, right? The day or the time in which Israel lost its kingdom was during the destruction of the temple, during the exile. Israel became kingdomless. It became governmentless because of the exile, as you know. Since the Davidic line was cut during the exile, they had no Davidic king. So the last time they had a Davidic king was during the first temple period. They simply had no Davidic king during the second temple period. Generally speaking, they simply had no kings. They stopped having a government in a way. They simply were kingdomless. Hence, when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God coming with him, he is talking about restoration, right? He is saying Israel is being restored now. The Davidic line is being restored now. Hence, the New Testament, in a way, is an answer to the question of exile, the question of sin. And so, for example, think what Paul says about the heart being transformed. He, in a way, is talking about Isaiah 40 through 66, right, and Jeremiah 31st as well, and also Ezekiel, in which they were promised that when the exile came to an end, or when God restores Israel, they would be healed and their heart would be obedient, because if their heart is not fixed and if their heart is not transformed, they would sin again, and they would call on another exile on them. Hence, the ultimate solution is the transformation of their heart. And when the New Testament talks about Christians having a transformed heart, having a new heart, or having a circumcision of the heart, the New Testament is talking about the exile as well. It is saying another exile is not necessary, another casting away is not necessary, because Christians now have a new heart that can actually obey God. So the question of exile really is important to understand the New Testament. So this question remained even after they returned to their land during the Persian period. As you know, the Persians under Qiros allowed them to return, right? ባሪያ ቂሮስ የሚለው ማለት ነው። So, but even though they were back, the exile seems to have continued in a profound sense, because as you know, prophets like Jeremiah, prophets like Isaiah prophesied that when the exile came to an end, or when God actually restores Israel, a whole lot of things will happen. So they will, of course, return back to their land. So there is the geographical element. They will begin to live in their own land. But that's not the only thing that the prophets promised, right? For example, think of Isaiah. Isaiah promised that first they will have the law written in their hearts so they can obey now. So they won't be sinning. The problem of sin will be removed once and for all. That's the first promise. Isaiah also promises that they will become lights to the nations. That is, they will become lights to the nations. They will govern the nations, and the nations will come to Zion to learn from Israel, to learn from the Jews. Not only that, he also promises them a prince. He also promises them a Davidic king. The kingdom will come back to them. Government will be returned to them. They will not be kingdomless, or they will not be kingless. Not only that, as I also promises about the restoration of the heavens and the earth, right? He also talks about the earth as a whole being healed because of the return, because of the restoration of Israel. But all these things didn't happen when they returned back, right? Even though they are in their land, they are actually under exile still. The Persians, even though they've allowed them to go back to their land and to rebuild the temple, they are still reigning over them. They have to obey, they have to pay their taxes and all that. And they can't, for example, coronate a king. That will be considered as a rebellion, and the Persians will come and simply eliminate that movement. So it was a very precarious situation, right? They are back in their land as promised, but they are not really back, or God really hasn't returned, because Isaiah and the prophets, they've also promised to them that when they come back to the land, one of the things that will happen is the return of Yahweh himself, right? Because God has abandoned them. That's what that's the destruction of the temple. That's what's represented by the destruction of the temple. Not only that, but Ezekiel also sees a vision in which the glory of God leaves the temple, right? So the prophets has promised them that God will actually come back. Yahweh will come back to his temple, but that doesn't happen. We read, for example, even after they finished building the temple, some of the elders, those of them that know about the first temple, they cried, right? They cried because the glory of the first temple was much more superior than the glory of the second temple. And they were in fact saddened. So it was a very precarious time. The Persian period was a very precarious period. Even though they are back in their land, in a way they seem to still have been under a theological exile, or under the root cause of their problem was not solved. It was not solved simply. So they are still under the yoke of the Gentiles, even though they are back in their land. So this happened during the Persian period. So the problem that started during the exile period or during the Babylonian period, it still continued. Even though they are back in their land, the questions remain. The theological problem remains. The religious problem remains. The political problems remain. They still have no king. They still have no Davidic king. So they are kingdomless. They are governmentless. So during this period, we see them shifting from the monarchic system. So if they coronate a king over them, the Persians will eliminate them. So they can't do that. Hence, we see the high priests, the religious leaders, playing a political role as well. Not only that, this is also the time in which most of the Old Testament was crystallized, or the canon we call now the Old Testament, the canon. Most of the crystallization, at least the Torah, and some of the prophetic works, or the whole of them, they were crystallized during this period. Hence, it was a very precarious period, the Persian period. So this remained almost for 200 years. After the Persian period, we find the Greeks, right? The Greeks under Alexander the Great, they conquered the Persians. Not only that, Alexander the Great was a very formidable warrior, as you know. He managed to conquer the known world almost in 3 years, as you know, within a very short period of time. So he really is the best known, probably the most successful military general in history. So he conquered the known world in a very short period. But a very important achievement of his, other than his military conquest, was that he managed to Hellenize the conquered nations. Right? To Hellenize means to, as you know, to transfer the Greek culture, the Greek language, and things like that amongst the conquered communities. So not only this period is especially important for the New Testament, as you know, because this is, for example, where we find Greek being a common language, right? So by the end of when you are reading the Old Testament, for example, the Old Testament is written in Hebrews, and of course there are some Aramaic, as you know. Aramaic is a reflection of the Babylonian exile. That's where the Israelites learned Aramaic. But when you open the New Testament, you will find a strange new language, right? The Greek language. The New Testament, all of the New Testament is written in Greek. So where did that come from? So that language, of course, came from this period. It came when the Greeks conquered Syrio-Palestine as well, and they pretty much Hellenized everyone. So the Palestinians, the Syrio-Palestine or Israel was under the Greeks almost for 200 years here as well. So during this period, they were so after the rise of Alexander, as you know, his generals. So he unfortunately died early. Unfortunately or fortunately, who knows, right? But he died early, and his generals began fighting over his kingdom. And the two well-known generals are the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So the Ptolemies, they were based at Egypt in Alexandria, and the Seleucids, they were in Syria and Antioch. So first the Ptolemies managed to rule the Israelites, and after them the Seleucid ruled the Israelites. So still the political question, the theological question remains ማለት ነው. Even though they are back in their land, they are still being governed by Gentiles. So during this period, a very important event happens in 167 before Christ. 67 before Christ. It is because one of the Seleucids ruler, one of the Seleucids king, a person by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, he managed to provoke the Israelites, the Jews, into rebellion. So what happened is not entirely clear, but from what we know from the book of Maccabees, for example, the Hasmonean period, what we know about this period is for the most part found in the book of Maccabees, in First Maccabees, or መቃባውያን የሚባለው መጽሐፍ ማለት ነው. So what happened was Epiphanes was a very keen Hellenizer, so he wanted to force Israel or the Jews into worshipping Greek gods, and he wanted to stop them from sacrificing to Yahweh. He in fact gets into the temple and he makes it impure by sacrificing a pig, mind you, on the altar. As you know, the Israelites, they consider pigs to be impure, right? They, for example, won't eat a pig or they won't touch a pig. But in order to provoke them, Antiochus Epiphanes sacrifices a pig on the altar in the temple. And not only that, we see him sending his soldiers and some compromised Jews to force everyone to sacrifice for Greek gods. So this, as you expect, was not accepted lightly by the Jews. The Jews they seem to have no problem subjecting themselves to political rulers. So, for example, they were under the Persians. So there is no known recorded opposition against the Persians. For example, they didn't rebel, and we don't see them rebelling during the Ptolemies period as well. And we don't really see them rebelling during this period as before they were provoked by Antiochus Epiphanes. So the times that we find them rebelling and later in the Jewish war in the Roman period as well, is when these governments, when these ruling powers try to stop them from worshiping God. So that seems to be when they choose violence. Anyways, this provocation was made by rebellion, and a person called Mattathias. He led this rebellion. First Maccabees tells us that he killed the Jews that was promoting that was promoting sacrificing for the Greek gods. He kills him and he flees into the mountains with his sons. So this is straight from First Maccabees. So he had his sons, and he pretty much presents a rallying call, and he invites people to follow him to rebel against the Seleucids. So surprisingly, this apparent small rebellion, it gets traction. People join it, and Judas Maccabeus, which is the son of Matthias, he manages to free Jerusalem by 164. So they managed to pull off a very successful rebellion, and they managed to conquer the Seleucids, or at least they managed to push them away from Jerusalem, or from Palestine, from Judah. So of course, this can be explained in different manners, but they somehow manage to make themselves free. Not only that, after they freed Jerusalem, they rededicate the temple, because, as I've said earlier, Antiochus Epiphanes has intentionally defiled the temple by sacrificing a pig of the temple. So we for example find this celebration, or the rededication of the temple, being celebrated in the New Testament as well. We find this in John chapter 10. የጆን ቻፕተር 10 ላይ የቤተ መቅደሱ መታደስ በዓል ነበር ይላል አይደል ጌታ። በእኔ በጎች በር ነኝ፣ በእኔ የሚገባ የሚለው ክፍል ላይ የመታደስ በዓል ነበር፣ የቤተ መቅደሱ መታደስ በዓል ነበር ይላል። So that በዓል is what we call the feast of Hanukkah, or the feast of dedication. That holiday simply it simply recounts how Judas Maccabeus and the Maccabeans rededicated the temple. So that holiday actually started being celebrated during this period. So this period is very important, because we see, for example, the Hasmoneans trying to put a king on themselves, or they try. In fact, they managed to be called a king, although there was some opposition to them, because they are not by blood Davidic. Hence, according to the Torah, they cannot be kings. But we see them putting themselves as a king, even though they were faced with some opposition from the population. But this really is the first time after the exile, after the first temple period, that Israel was at least semi-independent. They at least had a king, be it a legitimate or illegitimate king. Not only that, this was also a time in which that influenced a very nationalistic or militaristic attitude amongst the people. So, for example, the kind of militarism, or the kind of violent messianic expectation we find in the New Testament. For example, as you know, in the New Testament, the Messiah is primarily presented to us as a militaristic leader, right? The disciples, the kind of Messiah that they were expecting was, in a way, militaristic, right? He was a Messiah that can conquer the Romans and set his people free. And we, for example, find the zealots in the New Testament, right? ቀናተኞች የሚባሉት, which had a very militaristic outlook when it comes to their theology. So the zealots really had their motivation from this period. It was a time in which the Jews, using military means, using fighting, that is using violence, they became free and they somehow managed to return the kingdom to themselves, right? God and the prophets had promised to them that God Himself will restore the kingdom. They can get back this kingdom by fighting. So, for example, the Jewish war that you find in the Roman war, in the Roman period, that led to the destruction involved in. So those kind of ideas, they can be traced back to this period because they managed to pull off a successful military campaign. Their political outlook, their expectation seem to have changed in a way. So this period is also important because this seems to be the period in which religious sects like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes have formed. So, for example, the Pharisees, they can be traced back to this period. Of course, the history is not as clear as one would want it, but they seem to be formed during this period. So, the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees managed to rule almost for 100 years. This, for example, is the period in which the Israelites expanded, in which they geographically expanded into Galilee. So, as you know, when they were returning from exile, almost all of them in and around Jerusalem and trying to back the land that God had. So, for example, places like Galilee that we find in the New Testament, the birthplace and the center of ministry of Jesus, they were returned back to Israel during this period. So most of the geography that we find in the New Testament is really the result of this period in which the Maccabees, they were free enough to this period. So this was also a very important period. But after the Hasmonean period, so the Romans conquered them. They didn't really conquer them, to be honest. So the Romans were almost in because of an internal division between the Hasmoneans. They didn't agree on succession. Hence, one of the brothers simply asked the Romans to support him, and they did. And they sieged Jerusalem, and they simply took them back captive. So it was a bit unfortunate what happened. So even though the Hasmoneans were conquering the Greeks, they were really establishing themselves. So even though they free, they really were under the shadow of the Romans. So in 63 BC, General Pompey sieged Jerusalem, which the settlers or clan kings. So, for example, by the time of the New Testament, we know that Judah, the southern part, Jerusalem, Bethany, and and cities like those, they were being governed under that were directly appointed by the emperor, by the Senate. So sometimes they govern like this. They do this especially when they feel like it's important. That part is important, or be it politically or for trade or for something like that. But other less important as the Romans, they had to follow the Romans, but they can pretty much act quite independently. So, for example, Galilee, the northern part of Israel, it was under client king. So, for example, Herod Antipas, he was a local king. He was a Jew, and that was governing on behalf of the Romans. But for example, like Judah, because the temple exists there, they were directly governed by the Romans. So in the time of Jesus, much of Palestine was administered by the Herodians. The family was Edomian የኤሳው ልጆች የሚላቸው ማለት ነው። ሄሮድስ እንደዛ አይነት እንደሆነ እንረዳለን። He considered himself to be a Jew, and he tried to follow Judaism as much as possible. So the head of the family is a person that's called Antipater. He was very politically smart. Antipater is the father of Herod. So Antipater was a politically smart person who managed to negotiate both with the Hasmoneans and the Romans. So he was also existing quite comfortably during the Hasmonean period, and when the Romans came, he managed to make a deal with them, and as a reward, he was given the whole of Palestine to administer. That's because he gave military help to Julius Caesar. So after he was assassinated, after he was killed, Herod the Great, that is the Herods we find in the New Testament, the first Herod, that is the Herod that tries to kill Jesus when he was a child, he ruled from Judea. He ruled Judea from 37 before Christ up to 4 BC. And he was a client king. As I said, he was a local leader. So Herod, he was known for his cruelty. He was a very cruel person. So we can see this in the New Testament, but sources outside the New Testament testify to this as well. He was known for his cruelty. In fact, it is said that Augustus, that is the emperor, has said that it is better to be Herod's pig rather than being his son. So የሄሮድስ ልጅ ከምትሆኑ የሄሮድስ አሳማ ብትሆኑ ይሻላችኋል ብሏል ይባላል። So the reason for it being that since he considered himself to be Jewish, አሳማ አይነካም፣ አሳማ አይገልም። ግን ጨካኝ ደግሞ ስለሆነ ስልጣኔን ይቀሙኛል ብሎ የሚያስባቸው ልጆቹን ይገላል። He was known for killing his sons, and he also is known for killing his wife. So he was quite cruel, and the kind of characterization that we find of him in the New Testament is quite consistent with what you find outside of the New Testament as well. Aside to this, he was known for his buildings. He was a very amazing builder. He was known for renovating the Old Testament. The Second Temple, as it was built by the Jews, it was underwhelming, right? It was not a very impressive. It was not a very impressive project because, as you know, it was built by people that were returning back from exile. They don't really have much, and it was not very impressive. But Herod, he had greatly expanded the Second Temple. That is, he had renovated it. He had added courts to it, and by the time of Jesus, he had made it a very beautiful result. That's, for example, what you find in the Gospels, right? እነዚህ ድንጋዮች የሚሉት the disciples, it's because it was quite impressive with him, because they love him because he had renovated the temple, but at the same time they hate him because of his cruelty. So he's also known for building a model of the temple. So just to give you an idea of him. Okay. ታያችኋል። ብቻዬን እያወራሁ ነው እኮ።
عادي
ታያችኋል? ኦኬ So ዘጋሁትኝ እንዴ? Let me show you again. So this is the temple. ነገር ውስጥ ከዚህ ውስጥ ስትገቡ ነው ቅዱስ የቅዱሱ ስፍራ ያለው። ከዛ ቅድስተ ቅዱሳን ያለው እዚህ ውጩ ጋር መሰዊያ ይኖራል። ይሄኛው ምሳሌ ነው። ሀሳብ ማለፍ ይችላል እንላለን አይደለ? ይሄ መግባት ይችላሉ። ከዚህ ግን ማለፍ የሚችለው አይሁዳዊ ነው። ስለዚህ ከዚሁ ለምሳሌ ከዚህ ጳውሎስም ትዝ ካላችሁ አሕዛብ ይዞ ገብቷል ብለው ሊገሉት የፈለጉት ከዚህኛው ክልል the course of the Gentiles አልፏል ተብሎ ስለዚህ 60 ምናምን ላይ ነው ተሰርቶ ሁሉ ያለቀው ሪኖቬሽኑ ያለቀው። ስለዚህ ቤተ መቅደሱን አፍርሶ እንደገና አልሰራውም፣ ግን እሱን ሪኖቬት እያደረገው እያሰፋው እያሳመረው ቆይቶ ነበር። ስለዚህ ይወዱት ነበረ። አሴም ታይም ደግሞ በጭካኔውን በምንም ስለሚታወቅ ይጠሉት ነበር ሄሮድስን ማለት ነው አይሁዳውያን። ስለዚህ ሄሮድስ ነበር የሚገዛው ማለት ነው። ከሄሮድስ በኋላ ሄሮድስ ከሞተ በኋላ የሄሮድስ 3 ልጆች ፓለስቲንን እንደተከፋፈሉት እናያለን ማለት ነው። ፓለስቲንን እንደተከፋፈሉት እናያለን። ስለዚህ ጁዲያና ሰማሪያን፣ ይሁዳና ሰማሪያን የመጀመሪያ ልጁ አርኬለስ የሚባል ዘን ገሊላና ፔሪያን ደግሞ አንቲፓስ። ይሄ አንቲፓስ ሄሮድስ አንቲፓስ ለምሳሌ መጥምቁ ዮሐንስን ያስገደለው ሄሮድስ ማለት ነው። እንደን ትራንስ ጆርዳንን ከዮርዳኖስ ማዶ የሚባለውን ኤሪያ ደግሞ ፊሊፕ የምንለው ልጁ ይከፋፈለዋል ማለት ነው። ተከፋፍለው ማስተዳደር ይጀምራሉ ሄሮድስ ከሞተ በኋላ። ሄሮድስ እንደምታውቁት የሞተው ገና ጌታ ልጅ እያለ ነው አይደል? ሄሮድስ ሞቷልና ነው አይደለም መምጣት ትችላለህ የሚለው። ስለዚህ ሄሮድስ ያው ልጅ እያለ ነው ጌታ የሞተው። ስለዚህ ሄሮድስ የሚል ስናገኝ የፋሚሊ ስም ስለሆነ እየተቀጠለ ነው እንጂ አንዱ ሄሮድስ አይደለም። ሐዋርያት ሥራ ላይ ይሄ ኢምፖርታንት የሆነው ስለዚህ የመጀመሪያ ልጁ ልክ እንደ አብላይ ነው። ሶ what happened was የተሰጠው ጁዲያ ነው። ስለዚህ let me open another picture for you. So እንደምታውቁት በሁለት መንገድ ይገዛሉ ብያችሁ ነበር አይደለ? ቅድም ሮማውያን ኢዘር በክላይንት ኪንግ ተጠቅመው፣ ክላይንት ኪንግ ሎካል ነው። ስለዚህ በሚሄዱበት ቦታ ባሸነፉበት ቦታ ለምሳሌ እዚህ ኢትዮጵያን አሸንፎ ቢሆን አንድን ኢትዮጵያዊ as long as he follows their orders እንዲገዛ ይፈቅዱለታል። ግን ኢምፖርታንት ናቸው ብለው የሚያስቧቸውን ደግሞ ቦታዎች ራሳቸው ሮማውያን ከሴኔቱ የሚላኩ እንዲመሩ ያደርጓቸዋል። እንደዛ ብለን ነበር። ስለዚህ ሄሮድስ since he was also successful ከዛ ከአባቱም ወርሶ ከአንቲፓስ the whole of ፓለስቲንን ማስተዳደር ተፈቅዶለት ነበር። ስለዚህ ይህንን ኤሪያ ማለት ነው ፕሪች ስለዚህ ይደረስ ከርሰሬ ይታያል ማውዝ ማንቀሳቀሰው። ስለዚህ እዚህ ጁዲያ የሚለው አካባቢ እንደሰፈሩ ማስታወስ አለብን። ስለዚህ ትንሽ ነጥላግ በሃስሞኒያን ጊዜ ነው እስራኤላውያን የተስፋፉት። ንጉስም ከሾሙ በኋላ የተዋጉ ወደ ሰሜን ወደዚህ ገሊላ ምንለው እዚህ አካባቢ ነው ሰሜን። ስለዚህ ወደ ገሊላ ወደ ጣየር እና ጢሮስ እና ሲዶና ስለዚህ ወደ ሰሜን መስፋፋት የቻሉት በዚህ ጊዜ ነው። ስለዚህ በአዲስ ኪዳን ጊዜ ኦልሬዲ ይህንን ቅርጽ ይዘው ነበር ማለት ነው። ልክ አሁን ያለችውን እስራኤል ይመሳስላል። ፎር ዘ ሞስት ፓርት አሁን ያለችው እስራኤል ይቺ ናት። ስለዚህ ጁዲያን ይህንን ጁዲያ ምንለው ኢየሩሳሌም ያለው እዚህ ነው፣ ኢያሪኮ ያለው እዚህ ነው፣ ቤታኒ ያለው እዚህ ነው። ስለዚህ ይህንን አርኬለስ የሚባለው ልጅ እንዲያስተዳድር ተሰጠው ሄሮድስ ከሞተ በኋላ ሰማሪያን ጨምሮ። ያው ሰማሪያ በገሊላ እና በይሁዳ መካከል ነው ሁሌ። ያው ልክ ለምሳሌ በዓል ለማክበር ከገሊላ ሲሄዱ እስራኤላውያን በሰማሪያ ላለማለፍ ይዞሩ ነበር የሚለን ለዛ ነው። በገሊላ እና በይሁዳ መካከል ነው ሰማሪያ ኳይት ሊትራሊ። ስለዚህ ቀጥታ ከመምጣት እንደዚህ መዞርን ይመርጡ ነበር፣ በሩቅ መሄድ ይመርጡ ነበር በሰማሪያ መንገድ ላለመሄድ የሚለው ይሄን ነው። ሶ what happened was ጁዲያ ለአርኬለስ ሰጠ። ግን አርኬለስ እየጨቆነ እያናደዳቸው አመፅ እየተነሳ አስቸገረ። ስለዚህ አመፅ ቶሎ ቶሎ ሲነሳ ጥሩ መሪ ስላልነበር አርኬለስ ከዛ በኋላ ደግሞ ቤተ መቅደሱ እዛም ስላለ ሮማውያን ቀጥታ ይሁዳን ራሳችን በገቨርነር ብናስተዳድረው ይሻላል ብለው አርኬለስን አነሱት ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ አርኬለስ እንደ ጲላጦስ የሚባሉ ሮማውያን እናገኘው ኢየሩሳሌም ዙሪያ ከዚህ የተነሳ ነው። አርኬለስ ተነስቶ ቀጥታ ሮማውያን እኛ ማስተዳደር አለብን፣ እኛ ማስተዳደር እንችላለን አሉ ማለት ነው። ጉድ። ከዛ በኋላ ሰሜኑን ገሊላ ያለበትን ሄሮድ አንቲፓስ ያልኳችሁ ይሄንንም እንዲያስተዳድር ተሰጠው። ከዛ በኋላ ትራንስ ጆርዳን ሪቨር ማለት ይሄ ነው። ጆርዳን ሪቨር ይሄ መሀል ላይ ያለው ሪቨር ነው። ይሄ ከዚህ ይነሳና ከገሊላ ባህር ተነስቶ እዚህ ሙት ባህር የሚገባው ማለት ነው። ዴድ ሲ የሚገባው ባህር ወንዝ ነው ዮርዳኖስ ወንዝ ምንለው ይታያቸዋል። ስለዚህ ትራንስ ጆርዳን ማለት ዮርዳኖስን ተሻግሮ ሰሜኑን ክፍል ማለት ይሄን ማለት ነው። ይሄን እንዲያስተዳድር ተሰጠው ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ አርኬለስ ከተነሳ በኋላ ግን ሮማውያን ይሄንን ማስተዳደር ጀመሩ ማለት ነው። ጁዲያን ኢየሩሳሌም ያለችው እንደምታዩት እዚህ ናት። ኢየሩሳሌም፣ ኤማውስ እዚህ አካባቢ ናቸው። ቤታኒ እዚህ አካባቢ ናቸው ማለት ነው። so this happened ማለት ነው። so the problem with this approach አመፅን መከላከል ፈልገው ራሳቸው እንቆጣጠረው ቢሉም ሮማውያን ግን ከሮም እየተወከሉ የሚመጡ ሮማዊ አስተዳዳሪዎች እንደ ጲላጦስ አይነቶቹ they didn't really understand the customs of the Jews, you know, their peculiarities አንድ አምላኪ መሆናቸው እንደምታውቁት in the ancient world being a monotheistic being or worshipping one god is quite unique. So not everyone understood it and not everyone agreed with it. Hence they didn't really understood their unique customs. ለምሳሌ በሰንበት አይሰሩም, which is an odd thing for a Roman citizen to understand. Hence ከነዚህ ተወክለው የሚመጡ ሰዎች ቶሎ ቶሎ ያስቆጧቸው ጀመር ማለት ነው ሮማውያንን አይሁዳውያንን። ስለዚህ አመፅ በጣም የተለመደ ነገር ሆነ። ቶሎ ቶሎ ስለሚያስቆጣቸው there is rebellion አመፅ በዛ ማለት ነው። so ከተወከሉት ሮማን ገቨርነርስ ውስጥ የምናውቀው of course the most known governor ይሁዳን ወይም the southern part እንዲያስተዳድር ከተሰየሙት ውስጥ is ጌታን የሰቀለው ጲላጦስ አይደል? እሱ ወደዛ የመጣው አርኬለስ ከተነሳ በኋላ ነው ማለት ነው። let me open the slide again. አሲኖ ጥያቄ ሲኖር ልታስቆሙ ትችላላችሁ anytime ምልክት ብቻ ስጡኝ። Asfaw, do you want to ask?
Yes.
Sure.
ይህ ስለ ሁለተኛው ቴምፕል ማለት በዘሩባቤል የተሰራው አላለቀም ይሁን 46 ዓመት ይሉ ነበር በዚህ በዮሐንስ ወንጌል 2 ላይ 46ቱን ዓመት ሄሮድስ ነው የሰራው ወይስ እሱ አድሶ ነው?
ያንን ጊዜ እሱ ማደስ ነው። እሱ የእሱ ኢንፋክት ሪኖቬት አድርጎ የጨረሰው 60 ምናምን ዓመት ጋር ነው። ስለዚህ እያደሰው ነው እንጂ እንደገና እየሰራው ሳይሆን እያደሰው ኦልሞስት በ70 ዓመተ ምህረት ላይ ሮማውያን ሊያፈርሱት 3-4 ዓመት ሲቀር ነው እድሳቱ ያለቀው። ትልቅ ፕሮጀክት ስለነበር የጀመረው አለማለቅ ሳይሆን ሪኖቬት ማድረግ ነው እንጂ እንዳለቀማ እዛው ጋር አይተውት እኮ እነዛ ኦልሬዲ የመጀመሪያውን ቤተ መቅደስ ክብር የሚያውቁ ሰዎች ያለቅሳሉ አይደል? ዘወር አንደርወልድ የእግዚአብሔር ቤተ መቅደስ ይሄ ነው እንዴ ብለው ሲያዝኑ እናያቸዋለን። ከዛ ግን ሄሮድስ ሂወዝ ጀነራሊ በቢልዲንግ ይታወቃል። መሬት ይሄ መንገድ ይሰራ ነበር። ከዛ ምሽጎች ይሰራ ነበር። ታዋቂ የሆኑ ምሽጎች አሁንም ኢንፋክት አንዳንድ ፍርስራሾች ያሉት ማለት ነው። እሱ ልክ ብዙ ነገሩን ደግሞ ኢንቨስት ያደረገው ሄሮድስ ቴምፕሉ ላይ ነው። ቴምፕሉን በጣም ሲግኒፊካንትሊ ሬኖቬት አድርጎታል።
አይ ቴንክ ዩ። እኔ ፕሪ አንደርስታንዲንግ የነበረኝ ሶስተኛው ያኛው ዘሩባቤል የሰራው በአስሞኒያን ዘመን ላይ ፈርሶ ሶስተኛ የተጀመረ መስሎኝ ነበር።
ነው አይደለም፣ አልፈረሰም።
እሺ
the most famous የሆነው ሮማን ገቨርነር ጲላጦስ ነው እንደምናውቀው። he is the governor that actually killed Jesus, that actually crucified Jesus. So Pilatus, just like the rest of the Roman governors, he was known for really not understanding the sensitivities of the Jews, as I've mentioned. ስለዚህ ሪቤሊየን ሲበዛ እናያለን። ስለዚህ ዳይሬክት ሩል በሮማን ገቨርነርስ መገዛት ከተጀመረ በኋላ ቴምፕሉን ማኔጅ ማድረግ። ስለዚህ ገቨርነርስ they want to involve in the temple matters የቴምፕሉን ገንዘብ ለመውሰድ ይሞክራሉ። ቴምፕሉን ገብተው ማየት ይፈልጋሉ። ቅድም as I've mentioned, the Jews simply had a tendency to rebel whenever someone interfered in their religious matters. So as long as their religious incentives were respected, they seem to have no problem subjugating themselves to these Gentile rulers. But when their religion was messed with, they seem to rebel, at least after the Hasmonean period. So አመጽ በዛ ማለት ነው። አመጽ የበዛበት ፔሪድ ሲሆን እናየዋለን። So the Jewish war ምንለው what actually led to the destruction of the temple actually happens because of this reason. So the exact reason is not quite clear, but what we can say is the Roman governor, he seems to have one, not only that, the high priest, mind you, the high priest, he seems to have recommended, so because the Roman governor tried to steal from the temple, some kind of rebellion forms, and the high priest seems to have recommended that in order to squash that rebellion, that the governor should prohibit or stop the ritual system of the temple. So this kind of idea seems to have been raised, or at least the crowd seems to have perceived something like that. አመጹን ለማስቆም መሰዋት እንዲከለከለ ተወሰነ ጊዜ የሚል ሀሳብ ሪኮመንድ ያደረገ ይመስላል በጊዜው የነበረው ሊቀ ካህን። So this fueled up the rebellion much more seriously, and so the high priest's son Eleazar, he seems to have tried to stop the ritual system, and the rebellion, it picked up, and the rebels managed to take control of the entire city of Jerusalem. So the rebels, they controlled the city. So the actual Jewish war starts from this period ማለት ነው። The war that we call the Jewish war, that actually lasted for almost 7 years, and that resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple period. I mean, the Second Temple, it seems to have started like this because of a rebellion. So the war was a very deadly war. There are evidences that the rebels themselves, that they were not quite coordinated, and there was a lot of infighting between them as well. So in the year 67, Emperor Nero, he seems to have directed Vespasian who later on becomes an emperor himself, and his son Titus to take back Jerusalem. So Vespasian and his son, they made a slow progress, so they decided to siege Jerusalem. ስለዚህ they made sure that they somehow created a very desperate situation, as you can imagine. So they finally managed to conquer the city in AD 70. So one of the things they did after conquering it was to naturally destroy. It was very tragic period, especially if you think of it from a very Jewish perspective. So the temple was really, for them, it was the center of their religion. So they really were trying to recover from the exile, as you know. So the exile seems to have finally been over. The temple was renovated. It was looking good, and they were hoping for a Messiah that will return a kingdom for them, that they will have political freedom. So, but the kind of progress that they felt that they might have made, it simply was undone again, right? It was a very precarious position, this as well. So they are in their land, and they've in a very long and painful process, they've managed to retain for a king, because they have somehow managed to have the religious issue resolved, corrupt and all. So they are waiting for a political king. They were waiting for a Messiah that the progress that's made, it is undone. The temple is now destroyed, and they are under religious exile as well. They are back to religious bondage as well. So it was a very traumatic event, as you can imagine. We have writings that talk about this period. Writings like for Zizra or Second Baruch, they give us a kind of psyche that was being formed during that period, the kind of questions they were asking God, and the kind of theological rationale they were trying to provide in order to understand this event. So the temple was finally destroyed. So, as I've said, the war, it's the rebellion loosely continued, at least up the 2nd century. There is this revolt that we call the Bar Kokhba revolt, in which the Jews they revolted again against the Romans. It was a very coordinated kind of revolt. There are evidences that not only Jews in Palestine but Jews in Egypt as well participated in this rebellion. So the Romans they decided to finally quench every rebellion. So they defeated the rebellions, and they actually prohibited the Jews from entering into the city of Jerusalem. As you know, for 500 years they were not allowed back to Jerusalem, and the Romans actually built a temple for their gods on the Temple Mount. So that happened, but for all intent and purposes, and for our understanding of the New Testament, AD 70 is quite significant. It's when the temple was destroyed ማለት ነው. So the reason that we should Melissa, do you want to ask a question? Okay.
I don't have
So
questions. I'm attending.
okay, it's
finishing.
okay. I thought say you were giving me a clue. The reason it's important to understand this history is because the writings that we are going to study, writings like the Book of Tobit, writings like First Enoch, for example, First Enoch, portion of First Enoch talks about what happened during the Greek period, for example. The books like Maccabees, they took their background is the Hasmonean period, and there are also many other writings. So these writings that we are going to study, they were written during this kind of period. This period was a very hectic period, a very theologically unstable period, a very religiously unstable period. The Jews, for the most part, they were suffering in this period. They had serious theological questions. So these writings, in a way, they were written to answer those questions. Hence, one of the things that we do when we study these writings is to identify the specific period that they were written into. For example, when you read the Book of Tobit, when you write your paper on the Book of Tobit, one of the things that you should answer is when was it actually written? Was it written in the Persian period, or was it written when they were under exile in the Babylonian period, or was it written during the Roman period or during the Greek period? So this historical context is important in order to understand these writings. This period, this chaotic and hectic period, is actually what gave birth to the writings that we call Second Temple Jewish literature. So they were written in a very precarious period, in a very uncertain period. There were theological questions, there were political questions. So those writings were written to deal with this kind of historical context ማለት ነው. So the writings that we are going to study, they one talk about this period, and two, they are trying to cope with this kind of chaotic period in their history ማለት ነው. Okay, questions? Questions? Is it clear? Or is it confusing? ለመጠየቅ ራሱ ግልጽ አላረክልንም እያለችኝ ነው። የስተሰፋ
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very interesting where things are very good, but because of time and that's the way you have gone, it's very difficult to catch things. Therefore, as usual, it's better. By the way, explanation is very interesting. If we just read this PowerPoint, we can just understand better. Therefore, as usual, it's better if you share us your PowerPoint. And the other thing that I want to raise is this period, this Second Temple period. When I'm just reading materials, I just go to the period between 516 BCE to 70 AD, and I might have just, if I am mistaken, I'll just correct myself. And I heard when we say this period is from the time of the destruction of the first period, that means 586 or 87 to 70 AD. Which one shall we take, by the way? 586 to 70 AD or 516 to 70 AD?
Sure, whichever one you prefer. So there is a debate about when exactly should the start of the period be considered, and when should not only the start, but there is also a debate about when to end it. So when you read, you'll also, for example, see some works that place the end date at 140 something. That is after the squashing of the Bar Kokhba revolt I just mentioned. So this is not very. You just make up your mind. You just consider the evidences. Once the ones that consider it as starting from 586 is because that's when actual destruction of the temple happened. So, but if we are talking about technically, if we are saying technically Second Temple period, when did it start? So the name itself gives you a clue, right? The name itself tells you that it should start when the Second Temple is when it actually stood. So it is believed, it's believed that the temple was finished during at about 516. So those who want to define it technically will say the Second Temple period actually started when it actually stood. So there is no point starting it when if it's not standing. So, but the idea is there is a very similarity between the context in 516 and 586, because what made that period significance is really the destruction of the first temple, or the exile, and the kind of questions that it brought with itself. So that's the rationale. So it depends on the kind of work you're dealing with, or we can find a better term rather than saying the Second Temple period. For example, we can say post-exilic and pre-exilic Judaism. So the scholars would, for example, use that term rather than saying the Second Temple period. But this is nomenclature and it's not very important. Good. Leilas?
نعم يسمع له؟
Yes, Melissa.
لا.
Go ahead. So I can hear you.
The presentation is very interesting. The presentation is very interesting. Thank you very much. God bless you. And for the first time I joined today, and I need support from you. And please attach your slides and documents, because I suffered a lot due to health problem. Just now I'm recovered. God helped me. Just I'm trying to complete this course. So therefore, you have to, if there is opportunity, please attach me whatever documents. Thank you.
Sure. So they are attached as I've talked about some of the logistics for the course last time. So there is a shared drive that I use to share my PowerPoints and things like that. So let me paste last week's and today's discussion in the shared drive if I haven't already done that. Let me see. So there is no problem regarding that, and I have by default assigned Asafa as being a representative of sorts. That's because Asafa is one of my best students from last semester, and so I believe he can also help you regarding resources or questions and things like that. So
thank you.
Asafa can also help, but I've copied the PowerPoints, the shared drive now, so you can find everything there.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay, any other question? Okay, you can find the reading log, the PowerPoints, and relevant books in the shared drive, and it's also found in the Telegram group as well. So as I've said, the reason I use shared drives is because it's easy for me to track everything, and I can use this link, for example, for next semester for the rest of my students as well. That's why, but I can also copy it for you in the Telegram group as well if you have issues accessing it, but you shouldn't have. It's quite easy, especially if you are using your phone. So that might be an issue. I can assume copying it and downloading it might be a bit of issue, but if you can use your laptops, it's quite easy, and I can show you how to do it if that's an issue. Some documents are not readable; those may need. Yes. So you should. So some are not PDF. Yes, converters. Yes. I believe Muscano and the IT department can help in that direction, but you should also. It's quite easy to. You can, for example, download an EPUB reader, or you can simply convert them to PDF online. So try to explore that. So the reason some might not open for you using your usual means is because not everyone is in PDF form. Some are EPUB, or some might be in MOBI form, but those are file formats. So you should be comfortable. Using those kind of files. So I encourage you to install an EPUB reader. There are many EPUB readers, so try to download EPUB application using Play Store. Yes, if you are using your phones, use Play Store. But if you are on PC, there is one called Calibre. There is one called Ice Cream, which are quite free. So use those. You will encounter these kind of issues as you program. Sure. As you study. So rather than me solving it for you, I encourage you to try to download. There are sites like called Library Genesis. There is also Anas Archive, Zlib, things like that. I think you can find it in the Moodle, right? Or Muscano and others will give you an orientation. So you should be comfortable with this kind of things. So try and do that. Okay, any other question? Okay, if there is no question, be encouraged to start working on your assignments to read. I encourage you to do that. And if you run into any problem, feel free to ask, feel free to email me, and I can see what I can do. Okay. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brother Safa, please help me and try to send the documents as much as possible. Abe, didn't know.
ሰላም ነኝ ይኸውልህ መሌ አሁን የገባህበት ቴሌግራም ግሩፕ አለ አይደል ይሄውን እዛ ላይ ያሉ ዶክመንቶች እዛ ቴሌግራም ግሩፕ ላይ በሙሉ አሉ እሱ ባለፈው ዳውንሎድ ያረጋ ማነው አፕሎድ ያረጋች
በቃ ጥሩ ነው ምናልባት እኔ አፕዴት ዛሬ ነው አፕዴት አድርጌ ክፍያም ከፍዬ ምን ያደረኩት ዛሬ ስለሆነ
ሼር አድርጎ
አስፈለገ እንትን ላረግልህ ይችላልው ምንድነው ስሙ ፎርዋርድ ላረግልህ ይችላል ካላገኘው ጀስት እንትን በለኝ ስልኬን ያዘው መሌ
እሺ ንገረኝ እሺ
11
0911
73
73
79
79
41
41 ጌታ ይባርክ
ቴንክ ዩ መሌ ምንም ችግር የለም
ባረኩላችሁ